Look at this map. The border between modern-day Kenya and Tanzania is a perfectly straight line, slicing right through the middle of traditional Maasai territory. Geography doesn't draw straight lines. People do. In 1884, European powers held a meeting called the Berlin Conference. They sat around a table with a map of Africa and treated it like a massive cake. To avoid fighting among themselves, they carved up the continent and handed out the slices. Not a single African was invited to this meeting. Historians break this process into steps. First came the Scramble, a disorganized, chaotic rush by European nations to claim African land. Next was the Partition, the actual drawing of artificial borders on the map to formalize those claims. Finally came Colonization. This was the physical arrival of foreign powers on the ground to take absolute political and economic control over the territories they had drawn up. These three sequential steps systematically stripped traditional East African kingdoms of their independence, handing absolute sovereignty to foreign empires. This diagram maps out the three main motives for European invasion: economic, political, and social. The economic drive was the strongest. Europe was in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, and their new factories demanded huge quantities of raw materials and new markets to sell their mass-produced goods. Look at this photograph. Under colonial rule, local agriculture was completely overhauled. African farmers were forced to abandon their traditional food crops and instead cultivate cash crops, like the cotton seen here, specifically to supply European textile mills. There were other motives too. Politically, nations competed for prestige. Britain, for example, desperately wanted Uganda to control the source of the River Nile. Socially, colonizers claimed they were on a humanitarian mission to spread Christianity and Western civilization. Despite those humanitarian claims, the primary engine driving colonial expansion was the extraction of African land and labor to build wealth for European empires. It is a myth that Africans handed over their land willingly. Leaders like Omukama Kabalega of Bunyoro fought fiercely for nearly a decade, but their resistance met this: the Maxim machine gun. This early automatic weapon provided the overwhelming firepower that broke traditional armies. This grid outlines conquest methods. Beyond force was deception. Illiterate chiefs unknowingly signed English treaties, stepping into legal traps. Next, chartered companies like the Imperial British and German East Africa Companies established administration. Finally, colonizers used divide and rule, manipulating Buganda to defeat Bunyoro. The colonial takeover relied heavily on turning African kingdoms against one another, ensuring that indigenous groups exhausted their strength fighting themselves instead of the invaders. Look at this blank map. Based on the 1886 and 1890 partition agreements, which powers claimed Kenya and Uganda, and which took Tanganyika? 3 seconds. Time's up. Britain took Uganda and Kenya, shaded red, while Germany claimed Tanganyika, Rwanda, and Burundi in blue. With a few strokes of a pen, foreign diplomats erased centuries of established tribal borders, grouping diverse and sometimes rival cultures into artificial national boxes. The new rulers immediately overhauled the local economy. Traditional currencies, like cowrie shells, were entirely replaced by a centralized money economy, represented by minted coins, like this 10-cent piece from 1937. To transport their newly imposed cash crops to the coast, the British built the Uganda Railway. This massive infrastructure project served as the primary artery for colonial extraction, moving raw wealth out of the interior and onto ships bound for Europe. Building that railway across harsh terrain required massive amounts of manual labor. The British government deliberately imported roughly 32,000 Indian laborers to do the grueling work. After the tracks were laid, many of those laborers chose to stay in East Africa. They opened small shops known as dukas, like the one in this photograph, becoming the commercial backbone of major towns. This matrix breaks down the core mechanics of the period. The causes were driven by economic demands for raw materials. The methods combined military force with deceptive treaties and divide and rule tactics. The impacts included a complete loss of independence and an economy restructured for foreign export. Take a screenshot of this summary for your notes. The European invasion forced East Africa into the global market and laid down modern infrastructure. However, the artificial borders drawn in Berlin and the disrupted traditional cultures created deep political fractures that nations are still repairing today.